Hey everybody. So this video is going to be covering persuasion from the perspective of the ELM, or the Elaboration Likelihood Model. Now, persuasion is a particular kind of attitude change. All right, attitude change in general can happen even without somebody trying to change your attitude. But persuasion refers to a specific instance of attitude change in which somebody is trying to change your attitude. All right, so it's different than, for example, attitude change by cognitive dissonance theory. Although you can try to persuade someone using techniques inspired by cognitive dissonance theory, for example, the hypocrisy paradigm. You can ask me later if you're interested. But persuasion is a direct attempt to change a person's attitude, and probably the prevailing model to understand persuasion is the ELM, or the Elaboration Likelihood Model, and I'll explain why it's called the Elaboration Likelihood Model a little bit later. Now, when we're talking about a persuasion, there are a couple things that we need to consider. First, the message. All right. Now, there are certain qualities about a message that can change how effective that message is at persuading a person. For example, one of the first identified, at least in the research investigating the Elaboration Likelihood Model, is argument quality. Okay, so when we receive a persuasive message, people can use both good and weak, strong and weak arguments towards in favor of some position that they have. All right, and this is one method that has commonly been used in the ELM research, basically to manipulate to manipulate argument quality. All right. Now, how? So, what's an example of a good or a strong versus weak argument? Well, Petty and Cacioppo are the ones who established the Elaboration Likelihood Model, and one topic that they often use in their research is required comprehensive exams for seniors graduating from undergrad, from their undergraduate studies. So I'll give you an example of a strong argument. So one strong argument in favor of comprehensive exams is, and I'm reading this off of a methodological document provided by Rich Petty on his website. The National Scholarship Achievement Board recently revealed the results of a 5-year study conducted on the effectiveness of comprehensive exams at Duke University. The results of the study showed that since the comprehensive exam had been introduced at Duke, the grade point average of undergraduates had increased by 31%. At comparable schools without exams, grades increased by only 8% over the same period. The prospect of a comprehensive exam clearly seems to be effective in challenging students to work harder and faculty to teach more effectively. It is likely that the benefits observed at Duke University could also be observed at other universities that adopt the exam policies. That's an example of a strong argument. The weak version of a similar weak argument, that's a strong argument, but a similar version to that argument, but a weak one, is the National Scholarship Achievement Board recently revealed the results of a study they conducted on the effectiveness of comprehensive exams at Duke University. One major finding was that student anxiety had increased by 31%. One major finding, at comparable schools without the exam, anxiety increased by only 8%. The board reasoned that anxiety over the exams, or fear of failure, would motivate students to study more in their courses while they were taking them. It is likely that this increase in anxiety observed at Duke University would also be observed and be of benefit at other universities that adopt the exam policy. So, one's arguing, this can motivate people to work harder by, more effective techniques, things like that. So it motivates students to work harder and teachers to teach more effectively. And the other is all based in, we want to scare these kids so that they'll work harder. So the first one is considered a stronger argument than the second. Now, in general, strong arguments tend to be more persuasive than weaker arguments. Now, there are other variables that influence that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But on average, stronger arguments are more persuasive than weaker arguments. Another message quality that tends to change how effective a message is length of the argument. There's a general heuristic that people use that longer arguments must be better. So usually, on average, again, there are other variables affecting this, but longer messages tend to be more persuasive. So there are qualities of the message that can affect whether or not a person is persuaded. There's also qualities of the message source. All right, so who's delivering the message? So two very common qualities of the message source are expertise and attractiveness. On average, the more expertise a person or the source has, the more persuasive the message, provided that the message is possibly within that expert's purview. All right, so is the expert an expert about what they're talking about? And attractiveness. In general, again, on average, attractive sources are more persuasive than unattractive sources. So the more attractive the source is, the more likely that it will be persuaded. So qualities of the message, quality of the source. What else? Qualities of the recipient. Okay. So, for example, there's such a thing as attitude matching. There's such a thing as personality matching. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have an affectively based attitude. A attitude appeal steeped in affective terms. So this, a message that appeals to the emotional qualities of your affectively based attitudes. An affective appeal, an appeal based on emotion, is going to be more effective than an appeal based on information, cognitive appeals. Okay. Whereas, on the other hand, if your attitude is more cognitively based, cognitive appeals are going to be more effective than are affective appeals. Okay. Personality matching. So when a message is tailor-made to match a person's personality, it's going to be more effective. So, for example, in one study, participants, and this is an old study now, but you can tell because the advertisements they used were about VHS players. But in one study, participants were given an advertisement for a VH player. It was the same VHS player, but one advertisement emphasized the degree to which the VCR could facilitate a night at home alone. All right. Another advertisement for the VHS player or VCR emphasized the degree to which that it could help them, spend time with their friends. So, have a movie night with your friends, that kind of thing. Then they measured participants' personalities, and specifically along the dimension of extroversion and introversion. What they found is that the extroverts were more persuaded to and more interested to purchase the VCR when the advertisement that they received emphasized its ability to facilitate them spending time with others. Whereas the introverts were more persuaded when the advertisement emphasized the VHS player or the VCR's ability to help them spend time alone. All right, at home. So there are qualities of the message. There are qualities of the source delivering the message, and qualities of the recipient receiving the message. Now, the ELM argues that depending on how the person considers the message will change how likely they are to elaborate on that message. So I don't remember the exact words I just said. There are qualities that can change whether or not they will elaborate on the message. So, for example, in general, if a person is motivated, if they have the time, and if they have the ability to elaborate on a message, then they will. But if anything prevents that, if they don't have the motivation, if they don't have the time, if they don't have the ability, then they're not going to elaborate. Now, if they do elaborate, then they're said to be using the central route. If a person delivering the message is trying to persuade them, by getting them to think about it, they're using the central route to persuasion. Or if they're trying to get them to not think and they're trying to get them to kind of rely on certain heuristics, then they're using the peripheral route to persuasion. But if a person is more likely to, if a person is more likely to elaborate, they're using the central route to consider a message. If they are, therefore, they're using systematic thinking. They're using algorithmic thinking. They're thinking very carefully about the pros and cons of sorry, the message. If people are using the peripheral route, they're not considering those qualities really. Instead, they're focusing on really kind of tangential qualities, qualities that really aren't inherent to the message, but people use them as a cue to, how to basically they decide whether or not they change their attitude based on these tangential qualities. So again, central route processing involves systematically thinking about all the information being presented, the pros and cons, really considering whether or not the arguments are strong or weak. And in fact, people who are using the central route, so people who are elaborate on the messages that they receive, they are sensitive to argument quality, so they are going to be more persuaded by strong arguments than weak arguments. But people who are using the peripheral route, so they're not thinking systematically, they're thinking kind of heuristically instead. They rely on these heuristics to come up to decide whether or not the persuasive to decide whether or not to agree with the message. These individuals are not sensitive to argument quality on average, meaning really they're probably going to go along with the message regardless of whether or not that message is strong or weak. Okay, so that's where the model gets its name, the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model. People are more likely to elaborate when they're when they're processing the information systematically using the central route. They're less likely to elaborate when they're using the peripheral route. We're thinking heuristically. Now, I just want to make a quick side comment here. I'm kind of conflating terms from the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model, and the systematic heuristic model, which is a different model, and it was proposed by different researchers. Interestingly, the authors of the ELM and at least one of the authors of the heuristic systematic model went to the same graduate program, and I'm pretty sure they went to the same graduate program at the same time. So they were. It makes sense that they would have similar ideas. But they are two different models. But the two different models are very similar. In fact, in my exploration, I've only found one real difference between the two, and that is that the heuristic systematic model assumes that you can process a message both systematically and heuristically simultaneously, whereas the ELM, although I don't know that it explicitly assumes this, kind of implicitly assumes that you're either centrally or peripherally. But your book certainly kind of conflates the two, and it's easy to think about them going together because they're very similar. All right, now, so when are people more motivated to think? So when are they more motivated to use central route processing? Well, they are more motivated to use central route processing when the topic that the message is about is personally relevant to them. All right, so this is one of the first qualities found to increase people's likelihood to elaborate on a message. So if a message is personally relevant to me, I'm going to be more likely to consider it. And what they found is that when a message is personally relevant, people become sensitive to argument quality. All right, so when a message pertains to a topic that is personally relevant to a person, they start discerning whether or not the argument is strong or weak, and they're going to be more persuaded by strong arguments than by weak arguments. But when the message is not personally relevant, it doesn't affect me in any way. All right, then people aren't as sensitive to argument quality. So whether the argument is strong or weak doesn't really matter. So let's say that I'm a public school teacher in Oklahoma, and here last year there was a whole lot of talk about a bill that would increase pay. Okay, well, if I was a school teacher, okay, or possibly if I was a parent with a student in school, all right, then those messages would be more personally relevant to me. And for that reason, I may elaborate more on any message pertaining to that bill. Therefore, stronger arguments would be more convincing than would weak arguments. All right. So, personal. Well, I guess to continue that. However, if I was a college student, okay, with no children, all right, I'm not going to be a school teacher. Let's say I'm in school, in college, to be an engineer. The pay that public school teachers have has very little impact directly. People probably perceive it as having very little impact on their lives, and therefore, for them, it's less personally relevant. So for them, whether an argument is strong or weak is going to be all fairly irrelevant, okay? Because again, they're not elaborating on the message. They're not using the central route to consider that message. Okay. What else? Well, some people just like to think more. People who like to think are said to have a large need, or be high in the need for cognition. So the need for cognition represents simply the extent to which people enjoy thinking and want to think. So a person who's high in the need for cognition likes thinking. Even in their downtime, when they're not working, they'll probably sit there and just think about something. All right. Whereas this person who's low in the need for cognition, they're going to be less likely to think. They don't like it they don't enjoy it as much. Now, on average, people who are high in the need for cognition are going to be more likely to elaborate on a message. They enjoy thinking, so why wouldn't they think about a persuasive message that they're receiving? People who are low in the need for cognition, they're not going to think about the message as well, because again, they don't care much about thinking. All right. So there are some things that can motivate people to think. Well, time, obviously, if you're busy doing other things, so you're engaged in some other task, you're at work, all right, you're in a conversation with someone. If anything like this is preventing your ability to carefully think, to carefully consider what the qualities of the message that you're receiving, then you're probably not going to think. You're probably not going to use the central route. Instead, you're going to elaborate less. You're going to be less likely to elaborate, and therefore you will probably use the peripheral route, so you'll use certain heuristics. And then finally, the ability. Okay. Well, what kinds of things, what affects our ability to consider a message? Well, one, knowledge. All right, if you have no information, all right, you know nothing about the topic that the person's trying to persuade you about, then you're going to be relatively unable to carefully consider that message. All right, you're not going to really be able to assess whether or not the arguments they're making are strong or weak. All right, what else? Attention. Okay, so if you don't have the attention to pay to them, so let's say you're distracted, you're in the middle of something else, you're driving, whatever, but your attention is focused elsewhere. I mean, you have the time because the person's sitting there talking to you, but you're distracted. Your mind is on other things. If let's say maybe there's a loud noise or something, and it's constantly pulls your attention away. When something like this happens, then your ability to attend to the message declines, and that's going to interfere with your ability to elaborate. And so, again, you would be more likely to rely on peripheral cues or heuristics to make a decision about whether about the attitude object and about the message that they're giving. Some relatively recent work shows that the availability of regulatory resources influences your ability to elaborate. So, I believe it was Wheeler et al. Gave participants either a resource depletion task, in which if you've been in my in-person class, and I'm assuming all the people who are watching this particular video have, but just for you students who are in my class right now, I'm probably going to use this for an online class later. They'll need to know the information too. Anyway, then you know that one of the if you've been in my person class, you'll remember that one of the standard ways to manipulate resources, the availability of resources, is to first give everybody a task in which they go through a written document and they cross out every E. Okay. Well, then in a second task, you either let them to do what they've been doing, so you allow them to continue a routinized process or a routinized activity, or you change it up. You give them additional rules. So instead of crossing out every E, you cross out every E unless that E is separated by one letter in either direction from another vowel. So, well, the word vowel, V-O-W-E-L. Okay. Well, it's one letter removed from O, which is another vowel. So the E in vowel wouldn't be crossed out. The other rule you would give them is that if the E is followed by another vowel, then you don't cross it out. So in the word read, all right, it's R-E-A-D. Well, A is a vowel that immediately follows E, therefore that E wouldn't get crossed out. But following these rules requires the person to override their somewhat automatic, at least routinized, process of just crossing out every E. Now that requires regulatory resources. Now, after having done either the task where they just keep doing the routinized process or the one where they had to follow the additional rules, then participants got arguments that were either strong or weak. And then their attitude towards, I believe it was mandatory, well, I think it was the same kind of thing that I was mentioning earlier, which is mandatory exam taking. They got either strong or weak arguments about it, and then they assessed their attitude towards mandatory exams. Now, what happened? Well, in the condition where resources hadn't been depleted, so they just kept doing the routinized process, people were sensitive to argument quality. People were more persuaded by the strong arguments than the weak. But in the depletion condition, where they had depleted their regulatory resources, so they had experienced ego depletion, they were insensitive to argument quality. So whether the arguments were strong or weak, it didn't matter. It didn't affect whether they were persuaded or not. Okay. All right, that's 22 minutes. That's a long video. I'm sorry for it being so long, but I think I've covered everything that I was hoping to cover. So if you have any questions, be sure to send those bad boys my way. Otherwise, I'll see you later.